Fundamentally, the doctrine of karma is this principle that we reap what we sow. Okay, but the evolutionary approach to this karma doctrine is that we reap what we sow, surely, but the purpose of reaping what we sow is not for reward and punishment, but for moral and spiritual growth, our moral and spiritual evolution. In Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan Krishna says, Aneka janma samsittas tato yati parangitam. So having attained perfection in the course of many lifetimes, through all of your spiritual practices in the course of it, then you finally attain the highest goal of life. Every time you do a good action, that action leaves behind samskaras, latent mental impressions, which get lodged in the unconscious, which make us more prone to engaging in the same kind of behavior in the future, whether for good or bad, depending on what kind of action it is. Instant gratification like alcohol and cigarettes and drugs and this and that. And so it's this kind of perfect storm of different forms of instant gratification that I think is affecting youth in India as it is youth in Africa, as it is youth in the US. I mean, I think that's a deep commonality. And one of the biggest challenges facing the youth, a lot of the Indian educational system is still too oriented toward rote memorization, and it doesn't sufficiently encourage critical thinking, questioning, thinking for yourself, creativity, originality, and these kinds of indispensable qualities in being a good learner. Not just humans, but non-human animals and even plants have souls. They have jivas. These trees that we see, these animals that we interact with, all the way from ants, all the way up to dogs and cows and cats, they're ensouled. And what does that mean? It means that they all have, in a certain sense, moral standing, because we have to treat them as souls rather than as machines or instruments for human pleasure or use. It's never okay to look at somebody in a position of distress or suffering and say, it's their karma, and so therefore I'm going to ignore that person. That's not the right response.
Pranam Maharaj, welcome to the podcast of the Vivekananda Institute of Values, Ramakrishna Mission, Gurugram.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Maharaj, we've really been looking forward to this conversation, or we have actually started this podcast so that we could record conversations about ideas that may be relevant to youth. And so let's get started. We know that, at least I'm aware that you do work with youth in your role as a monk at the Vedanta Society of Southern California. Could you first tell us a little bit about your work with youth over there, and then we can go forward?
I'm a Hindu chaplain at two universities here in Southern California, the University of Southern California and UCLA. So I go regularly to teach to kind of hold interactive discussions on spiritual topics relating to Vedanta and other things. So right now, I've started teaching my new book, Karma and Rebirth and Hinduism, at the University of Southern California, and we're having a good time just kind of going back and forth on various issues relating to these doctrines. Yeah.
Okay, so that's something I'd love to talk about maybe a little bit later. I do, as you know, have a copy of this book. It's a slim volume, and I've had a chance to read it. And I think there are some very interesting ideas in it in the 45 minutes odd that we have. Maybe we could just touch upon. Before you actually went to California, you were, of course, here in Mysore for a couple of years. And that's when we had a chance to meet. And even before that, you were there at the Vivekananda University in Kolkata. Could you just tell us about, your experience, again, because we're really talking about interacting with youth, your experience from the time you worked at the university, then moved to Mysore, your experience of interacting with the youth in India. What would you say about that?
So yes, I was born and raised in the US and then did my PhD at Berkeley. And then I moved to India in 2009 and joined the order in 2010. And I spent 11 years in Belumad at what was known as Vivekananda University, and now it's called RKM Berry. And I was looking after the philosophy department. And so I interacted a lot with, obviously, philosophy students primarily. And what I found is that they're very sincere, motivated, but at the same time, kind of underserved, I felt, by most of their teachers because of the nature of the educational system. And I don't want to generalize, but it does seem like a lot of the Indian educational system from K through 12, but then even in higher studies, is still too oriented toward rote memorization, and it doesn't sufficiently encourage critical thinking, questioning, thinking for yourself, creativity, originality, and these kinds of indispensable qualities in being a good learner. So that's what I found. And after 11 years, I moved to Mysore for a different kind of experience. I wanted a taste of South India. And so I had a very nice time in Mysore, in our ashrama. And after 1.5 years in Mysore, I was asked by my order to serve here in our Hollywood Center. So since 2022, so for about 3 years, I've been serving here. And the one thing that's remained constant from the university in Bellumat to Mysore, even to Hollywood here, is my academic research, my academic publications, my writing. That's been going on from the very beginning. This book that you just mentioned, The Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, is my fourth research monograph. And I've got multiple writing projects going on right now as well. But now I also have added on top of that a number of other new things, like I'm teaching a lot of different classes and giving talks in various places. And then, of course, this Hindu chaplaincy at these two universities, and a few other responsibilities. So yeah, that's a kind of brief account of my monastic journey so far.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because you've had a chance to interact with, of course, you've grown up in the US, but then you've interacted with youth for extended period of time, among other people, of course, because you started the university, then you were at Mysore, and then you're now at Hollywood. Do you think there are certain common challenges that youth face, both in the West and in the East, as one might say?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think because of globalization, the challenges that youth face in almost all countries many of them are the same. And I think one of the biggest ones is that I think we're living now in an age of unprecedented instant gratification. We've always had instant gratification of different forms, but just the sheer amount of instant gratification that we're being bombarded with, inundated with on a moment-to-moment basis is, I think, unprecedented. And I think it's characteristic of our current age, thanks to internet, social media, AI, smartphones, streaming. When I was growing up in the 80s, if I wanted to watch my favorite TV show, I'd have to wait 1 week for the new episode to air, right? And so now I can binge watch an entire season of my favorite show in a single day. And then there are dating apps, there pornography, and it's just so many different forms of instant gratification. And then on top of that, the traditional kinds of instant gratification like alcohol and cigarettes and drugs and this and that. And so it's this kind of perfect storm of different forms of instant gratification that I think is affecting youth in India as it is youth in Africa, as it is youth in the US. I mean, I think that's a deep commonality. And one of the biggest challenges facing the youth, they're growing up in a very different environment from the kind of environment that I grew up in, where, an afternoon was spent, I would play outside in the woods with my friends and run around. I'd ride my bike, I'd fall, I'd get hurt. So almost none of this is done anymore. People are just staring at their phones all day. So it's quite troubling. I think that we need to tackle this problem head on. And I think Vedanta can actually help us to address some of these modern challenges.
Okay, and we'll definitely get there. I'm just wondering though, when we talk about instant gratification, I think there's been more and more understanding as well of what dopamine can do, how it gives us a kick, and in a way it keeps us hooked into all of these things which almost become addictive, right? One of the ideas that I've been recently thinking about is that it almost looks like, especially because I'm also working with children in schools here and youth in colleges, they also seem to be having a lot more experience. For instance, in the way they speak. And often we are told that we at least think that there's more exposure in a way. Would you think that all of this exposure to also perhaps leads to a kind of experiential understanding of the world?
Can you first clarify, what do you mean when you say that they seem to be more experienced?
Okay, I'll give you an example, right? My son is 11 years old. So about 3 years ago, when I asked him if he would like to go for a trek, he was 8 at the time. He said, "Oh no, I'd like to just watch that on YouTube."
Watch what on YouTube?
A trek. I just want to watch people trekking on YouTube. And it really raised some flags for me. So I'm just wondering, so is it leading to this kind of almost like a belief, not just in, I'm sure it can also be extrapolated as you take it forward, right? The sense that, okay, I'm experiencing things for what they are. Do you think, or what is it really doing psychologically, right? I'm just wondering, um, what are the effects, do you think, maybe put it another way, what do you think the exposure to all of this information is doing to the psychology of youth?
I don't think that anecdote that you just mentioned is a very positive thing, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously it's far preferable that your son join you on the trek, rather than just watch, because there's a world of difference between seeing it on YouTube and actually participating in it. And that's the problem, is that now people are kind of having experiences vicariously through technologies rather than, and so instead of in-person interactions, face-to-face interactions, they prefer to just stare at a screen. And I think that's a huge part of the problem. So I think that's symptomatic of that deeper problem I was talking about, that we're living in an age of instant gratification, and also of kind of virtual realities of different kinds. And AI is just another layer, compounding these problems. And so now there are these new problems, these newer problems, of people falling in love with AI chatbots, literally having, deep emotional connections with AI chatbots. And of course, when something goes wrong, of course, they freak out. Sometimes some are committing suicide, and there are all sorts of sometimes breaking up marriages. So yeah, none of this is good, obviously. These are all problematic. Yeah.
Okay. So in fact, this was just post-COVID when that I had the conversation with my son, and thankfully I had the agency to kind of take him out of school for about a month and take him on a road trip. So we went to a place called Sandur, which is known as the Switzerland of the South. And I asked him, after we actually went for a trek in a Slothbed sanctuary, I asked him, okay, do you think this is the same as watching this on YouTube? And thankfully he said, no, it makes a world of difference to actually be experiencing in reality.
Yeah.
Which actually brings me to the second part of the question, right? When you speak about vicarious experiences, and also I'm also wondering how it's tied to expression, right? Because I'm thinking of, say, experience as something that doing something, but then I think with social media, there's also this kind of incentive to share it with the world at large, right? So I'm just wondering, do you think when you talk about social media with all of the forms of expression now available to you, how would you characterize that? I mean, let's say pre-social media and in the current age of social media, and also considering there's AI, do you see there's some difference in the way expression is also manifest?
Yeah, I think that part and parcel of this age of instant gratification is that we're also living in an age of narcissism. And one of the co-founders of YouTube, he said, everybody in their heart of hearts wants to be a star. They want to be a celebrity. They want to become famous. And so now YouTube and other kinds of social media platforms are making that possible in a certain sense. And so everybody's kind of trying to get their 15 minutes or 15 seconds of fame by taking pictures of themselves with very little clothes on, or doing provocative things, or doing very dangerous or risky things, to get as many likes as possible, to get as many retweets, and so now all of this is kind of, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's changed the way we express ourselves, but the question is the motivations behind the expression, behind the self-expression. So self-expression is excellent, but what are the motivations? If the motivation is to get as many of these dopamine bursts as possible by getting a bunch of likes on my videos or my posts, then that's not exactly a very spiritual approach. And it's probably a recipe for unhappiness and depression at the end of the day.
Yes, and I think there are enough reports also about how it affects, I think, especially teenage girls disproportionately in terms of their exposure to social media. And I came across a recent report about how, again, teenage girls and younger women are relying more and more on AI because they feel that they get someone who's listening to them constantly, someone who's not judging them. And sometimes they even believe that it's giving them valuable advice. But I think one of the findings of that report was that it does not seem to encourage them to look for in-person interactions So it seems to be replacing human interactions with AI
Yeah, I
interactions.
mean, part of the thing is, one of the reasons why I think so many people like AI as a therapist, as a partner, as a friend, it's because it's AI up till now has been pretty sycophantic. It'll tell you what you want to hear. It'll flatter you. It's not going to talk back. I think that's part of the reason why people like pets so much. Why they like cats and dogs, because they don't talk back. You can, and so like I like my, some people like their pets more than they like human beings. Why? Because human beings have this pesky feature, which is that they talk back. They can challenge you. They can disagree with you. They can call you stupid. But AI won't do that, or it's very unlikely to do that, and because the AI companies will lose money, right? And so there's also kind of the profit motive behind some of this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, right? Because so I'm going to now start getting into some of your writings, because I think you've touched upon many of these ideas in different ways, at least in the way that I have seen them. For instance, when you talk about earlier, when you spoke about how almost is this equalization or democratization of information because of the internet, how it's kind of spreading across the world, but with it also bringing these challenges. When you were talking about Swami Vivekananda's work, you spoke about Vedantic cosmopolitanism, right? That's in your book. I'm just wondering, do you think when we talk about, and I'm just taking a very naive understanding of what cosmopolitanism is, challenges of the modern age and big cities, do you think that, about Swami Vivekananda's message, the way you've understood it in terms of, and it's also relevance to the modern day challenges, how would you kind of, talk about that?
Okay, that's a big question. You're asking me how to relate Swamiji's ideas about Vedanta cosmopolitanism to
the modern age, really. The relevance of Swami Vivekananda's message to the modern age.
Okay, there are many aspects that I'll just mention one, which is specifically focusing on his cosmopolitanism. One thing he told his brother disciples that if he had the money, he would send everybody, each one of those disciples, abroad. He would send them outside of India. And he said one of India's biggest problems is that it's been so insular for too long. Indians have been like frogs in a well. And he said, if there's been one main benefit of British colonialism, it's that the British exposed Indians to the rest of the world. And I think it's absolutely crucial. And it's still a problem, I'd say, in India, is that many Indians are still too much into navel gazing, and not striving to learn from other countries, other cultures. And I think this modern age is moving in the direction of a radical global cosmopolitanism. And a true cosmopolitan is somebody who is open to learning from all quarters and will strive to learn and adopt what's best from all cultures. And the first step is being open, being receptive to what other cultures have to say, as opposed to prejudging them or judging them negatively, as many people often do. And so what we need now is a cosmopolitan openness and receptivity to what the world has to teach us.
Which it kind of brings me to my own experience. I had a chance to work at an international school, and it was in the IB curriculum, the International Baccalaureate, in the diploma program. And because that's Geneva based, and it's of course not widely available in India, but one of the things there was an emphasis on was on critical thinking, right? And there's actually a 2-year course on theory of knowledge. Now, what I observed was that at least some of these students, when they went for the higher studies, either in India or to institutions abroad, they seem to have a head start, at least in the first year of college. Then I think it kind of equalizes. But I think because the reason I'm asking, the question I'd like to ask is, since I think one of the aspects of I think dealing with modern life, and I think perhaps being secure in your own identity while also being open to other influences, is having this viveka or this critical thinking faculty well developed, right? So I'm just wondering, how do you develop this faculty? Is it for the select few? What are the benefits? A lot of things in that, but just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, again, we go back to the educational system in different countries. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking is thinking, not just accepting something because somebody in a position of authority tells you something, but reasoning on your own, weighing its reasonableness for yourself, and then judging whether that's something that you ought to accept or not, and asking questions about it. I think that's what critical thinking is about. I think in India's history, there's always been an emphasis on critical thinking, but that especially in the colonial era and then even post-colonial now, from 1947 to now, what I'm finding is that there still isn't enough of an emphasis on critical thinking in the curriculum in India. At the same time, I'd also emphasize that this is something I bring up in my talks a lot. I think it's a real problem, is that there's still a cultural bias in India towards the sciences and against humanities, what they call the arts, right?
Yeah.
And so the arts are where you should be finding some of the most active critical thinking, but in India, at least, we find the least critical thinking. It's just professors writing things on the board about, William Shakespeare said this and Immanuel Kant taught this. And they just expect their students to just memorize what's on the board, regurgitate it on their exam. And that's a class. And it's a real shame because we should be inculcating into this next generation of children these very, very important virtues like critical thinking and originality and creativity.
Yeah. And I think at least from Viva, we have introduced this college course called Vivek Marg, where there's a module on what we call as conscious choice making. And even as we are interacting with youth, what I've observed when we were at a premier institution in the last semester was that there was hardly any participation in the classroom. Right? We try to make our classrooms very interactive, facilitative in approach, but usually they are quite withdrawn, hesitant to share their views. And so sometimes, and the strange part was though, when we actually circulated a survey, a baseline survey, and then an endline survey, many of the students claim to have benefited, right? So we are still in a very early stage as far as the college program is concerned, right? But I think I think as a product of the system, and secondly, having now in a different role as an educator working with professors and with students, I can fully resonate with what you're mentioning.
Yeah. I think part of the problem, what you said is striking because I think part of it is that they're so used to a different way of being educated, right? They're used to being scolded if they express their own opinion. And so I think that there's this kind of default fear to speak out because of that conditioning, that prior conditioning. So that needs to be broken out of them first.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to take time, thankfully, because we introduce our programs very early, right from primary school. What we've seen, at least the bright shoots in a way, is that when there is an opportunity in the classroom for a kind of step back from a teaching mode into a kind of discussion mode, then somehow they are able to express themselves very freely without fear of judgment. One of the findings, though, from a survey was that I think there were a couple of things that the students actually resonated with. One of them was the Gunas. So we introduced that in a very practical way and said, okay, now when you think of the 3 Gunas, how do you think it might change your view of yourself and your way in which you can interact with the world? And it really resonated with them. It's one of the ideas that you've spoken about often. So I'm just wondering if you could, for the people who are listening to this and watching this, the understanding of the Gunas, for any of us, not just for youth, but for any kind of spiritual aspirant, what do you think it can help us with?
Sure. Yeah, I think that this doctrine of the Gunas is immensely practical. Gunas are often translated as qualities, but I prefer the translation energies. Because I think these 3 energies of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, they manifest in human behavior in different ways. Okay. And so just to give you an example, the energy of Tamas typically manifests as things like laziness, oversleeping, jealousy, depression, and so on, lethargy. The energy of Rajas manifests as egoism, pride, arrogance, ambitions, worldly desires, worldly attachments, and so on. And the energy of Sattva manifests as ethical qualities like compassion, and gentleness and sincerity, and simplicity, and then also having kind of spiritual leanings, devotion, and so on and so forth. So how does it help us? I think it helps us in a number of ways, but I'll emphasize two ways. Number one, it helps us in what I would call brutally honest self-assessment. It helps us to understand ourselves, first of all. In the beginning of spiritual life, and not just in spiritual life, but just in life in general, it's really important to know who you are. Nobody's perfect, and we shouldn't pretend that we're perfect. We should understand who we are, warts and all, the good, the bad, the ugly. And this paradigm really helps us to understand ourselves better in a very precise and very fine-grained way. We can kind of pinpoint aspects of our lives that need attention, that need to be improved, right? So I'll just give you an example. Okay. Let's say you have a spouse and you have children and you have a job, right? That means you're interacting with your spouse. You're also interacting with your children. You're also interacting with your coworkers. Now, all these relationships can be either tamasic, rajasic, or sattvic. Okay, what do I mean? Let's just take the example of your relationship with your spouse. If it's very tamasic, it means that there's a mutual neglect on both sides. You just neglect each other, basically. Oh, do whatever you want. I don't care. Okay, that's not an ideal relationship, obviously. A rajasic relationship will look like almost the opposite. You're clinging to each other. There's intense emotional attachment on both sides. What's called by psychologists an unhealthy codependence. A lot of emotional drama and highs and lows. I hate you, I love you, and this and that. Also not great. A sattvic relationship with your spouse is one where there's more of a kind of detached love. There's a love, but it's not grounded in a strong emotional attachment. It's grounded in seeing the divine in the other person, helping them along in their own spiritual path, giving each other space to breathe and to grow in their own way, while at the same time supporting each other. So that's more sattvic. And the same thing can be said. If we had more time, we could have a whole podcast just on the gunas, but we can talk about rajasic parenting, which is what Americans call helicopter parenting, hovering over your child, micromanaging them, trying to mold them in your own image. Sattvic parenting, letting them grow in their own way. Recognizing that their soul is on their own journey and that the parent is meant to facilitate that soul's journey rather than to dictate it from above, and so on. So what you might find, I'll just give you one example. You might find, wait a minute, my relationship with my child is very sattvic, but my relationship with my spouse, very rajasic. So it helps you to pinpoint, even among your relationships, where you need to do the fixing, where you need to, try to do better, and so on and so forth. So it really helps. When you're stuck in traffic, what kind of music do you listen to? Is it tamasic? Is it rajasic? Is it sattvic? So you can also make these kind of spot edits in a way. And you can if you say, look, I'm more or less moving in a spiritual direction, but, I've got this addiction to cigarettes that's really holding me back. That's very rajasic and tamasic. So let me try to get rid of that habit. Or, you know what? I'm stuck in traffic every day. Instead of complaining about it and getting angry and developing road rage and listening to, popular music, let me listen to some nice bhajans. Let me do japa, mantra japa. Let me use this time in traffic as an opportunity for spiritual practice. That's just another example.
As a parent myself, and as also with my relationship with my spouse, I can clearly see that there are different ways in which each of us is kind of acting, sometimes reacting in different parts of our life. But just two more threads I'd like to take forward in the time that we have, right? One is, since you mentioned being sattvic is, or at least trying to develop those qualities is what having these ethical virtues, right? Now that's a word. The word ethics is something which Swami Medhananda in his book, when he's talking about Swami Vivekananda's perspectives on moralities and ethics, he says it's usually quite neglected in India. He says ethics as a subject is quite neglected in India. And he's done some phenomenal work on ontological ethics, and you've developed that further, and you call that Vedantic virtue ethics. And it's also an area that I'm personally very interested in. And it's something that we're trying to develop more around, even at Viva. For someone who's, for instance, we were recently invited to conduct a session on ethics at a public sector unit. If we were to kind of articulate, so what's the use of understanding ethics in our life, how would you respond to that?
Well, look, I mean, we're bombarded with different standards and different advice, and it's very difficult now to know what's right and what's wrong in a given situation. It's very, very difficult. And that's part of the value of understanding something about ethical theories, because different ethical theories will give you different ways of determining what one ought to do, what one ought not to do, and why. Okay. And so just to give you an example, utilitarianism, it comes in different varieties, but the basic idea is that you should do what brings the maximum benefit to yourself and to others. That's the idea. Now, you get into these tricky situations sometimes if you try to follow a utilitarian calculus rigorously, but that's, at least it does give you a kind of way of living, an ethical way of living. And there are other paradigms, and I think that Swami Vivekananda teaches a distinctive one from the standpoint of Vedanta, which I call a Vedantic virtue ethics. And here, I think his view is that, look, instead of using some kind of formula to determine what's good, what's wrong, what's bad, what you ought to do in a given situation, what you should try to do is to develop a good and noble character. And once you do that, anything that you do will be automatically good. It'll be good by dint of flowing from a good character. Okay. And so this should give us hope, because this is something that Swami Vivekananda emphasizes again and again. This is not, we're not fated to be a certain way. No matter what we are now, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future, right? And what does Swamiji say? He says that no matter what you've done, if you start to make the effort to do good things now in the present, what will happen? Every time you do a good action, that action leaves behind some skaras, latent mental impressions, which get lodged in the unconscious, which make us more prone to engaging in the same kind of behavior in the future. Okay. Whether for good or bad, depending on what kind of action it is. But the point is, every time we do something good, there's a kind of reinforcement mechanism that leads us to do more good things in the future. Ultimately, that forms into a good habit. And then he says, character is nothing but a bundle of good of habits, not necessarily good habits, but character is a bundle of habits, right? So if we have a bad character or a medium character, a neutral character, we can make it a good character by engaging in more and more good activities, more and more good actions, and being well-wishers to everyone in the world. By doing that, we convert our bad habits into good habits, and then we develop a good character. And I think that's very empowering, I think, to not just to the youth, but to everybody.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's fascinating because it essentially gives us back the agency to kind of work on ourselves. So it's like really consciously working on ourselves. I go back to thinking, just reflect on being aware of, as you said, I think being very honest with ourselves, but what we're thinking about, how we are acting, our habits, and so on. The other thread, which you mentioned about in the context of parenting, is about how, Sattvic parenting is also about recognizing that each child is also on their own journey, right? And I attend your classes online, and I do remember a response that one of the other participants had given about how understanding the ideas of karma and rebirth in a way allows us to see our role as parents through more of a guardianship lens, right?
He said stewardship mentality, yeah.
Yeah, stewardship mentality, and it really, really resonated with me, right? And so I'm actually just, because in the time that I'm just wondering, right, because you've written about karma and rebirth and Hinduism. Would you like to maybe just share why do you think it was important to, write this booklet at this point in time? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure. A lot of people talk about karma and rebirth, not just Hindus, but even, Buddhists, of course, who believe in karma and rebirth as well. But it's kind of a trending topic in a way. And there was a Pew survey done recently in the US. And what they found is that something like a third of Americans believe in rebirth, which is astonishing because not like a third of Americans are Hindu and Buddhist. There are so many people who are Christians and whatever, but and Jews, and they also believe in, many of them believe in rebirth. So there's something that resonates. There's something in these doctrines that resonates deeply with many people. Okay, that's one of the reasons. So I just think it's important to really have a better and deeper understanding of what these doctrines actually entail. But also, even for people who already believe these doctrines, I think many Hindus, they believe them on faith, but number one, if they're asked challenging questions about them, they may not be prepared to answer those questions. If in the course of thinking about these doctrines, they have doubts, how do they respond to those doubts? Right. So that's another main purpose of the book, is to explain the best arguments in support of the doctrines of karma and rebirth, to look at how objectors, skeptics might respond to those arguments, and what are the best skeptical arguments against the validity of karma and rebirth, and how might proponents of karma and rebirth defend these doctrines against those arguments and criticisms and objections. And just to expose ourselves, this is what's called critical thinking, actually, is really thinking about things so that we can strengthen our own faith. This is what Christians call faith-seeking understanding. I already have faith, but I want to deepen my faith. And, if I'm challenged, I should be able to defend my articles of faith as well. So that's part of the reason. And then secondly, I think that even if there are many Hindus who talk about karma and rebirth, I find that in many cases, they don't make these doctrines practical in their day-to-day spiritual life. How on a day-to-day basis might these doctrines impact in a very beneficial and positive way the way that we live our lives, the way that we engage in spiritual practice? I think it has tremendous implications. Like you gave one example, which is that as a parent, that answer from my student, by the way, his name is Ellis, one of my most brilliant students, how it can actually tangibly change your philosophy of parenting, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it has tremendous ramifications. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to, of course, in the show notes, I'll add a link to your work, which is available as an open access PDF, and of course, also the link from where anyone who's interested can purchase the book, because I think you contrast this retributive understanding of karma and rebirth versus the evolutionary understanding. And I think as someone who's really born and brought up here, has traveled to the villages, I remember having a conversation once with, I was working with an organization that worked with persons with disabilities. And so once I was at a remote village in Karnataka, and I saw this person, I can't remember his exact condition, but he has a certain physical disability. I think it was also, and he was really neglected is what I could see. So I asked one of his caretakers, why is he in this condition? Because we have far better facilities, at least in some places in Bangalore. And she said, it's just karma. And it struck me so hard because it felt like as if he had been ordained to suffer. And I think one of the things
Right. It sounded dismissive to you, right? But that's not the right way to think about the doctrine of karma, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what I like is one of your other classes where you mentioned about how maybe that person's bad karma it also gives me an opportunity to serve. And
right. Actually, what I meant is that person, even though that person is suffering, and that is karmically earned in a certain way, at the same time, that same poor person, the suffering person, has earned enough good karma such that you have come into his vicinity or are in a position to help that person. Now, if you, while being in that position, refuse to help or choose not to help, then you're accruing bad karma. So on both sides, we have to understand that the way that our karmas are intertwined are extremely complex. And it's never okay to look at somebody in a position of distress or suffering and say, it's their karma, and so therefore I'm going to ignore that person. That's not the right response.
Yeah, and I think at least this evolutionary understanding, which you've shared over here, I think can really empower each of us to look at maybe all of the suffering around us and think, okay, what can I do? And I think that again comes down to what Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhananda really said about worshipping, really the divine in all those around us, right? In spirit of service.
Yeah, I think for those of the listeners who aren't familiar with these concepts of retributive karma versus evolutionary, I should just give a little brief explanation. So the retributive conception of karma in Hinduism is a kind of mainstream or standard one that's pretty popular. And it's sometimes mentioned on TV shows in a kind of caricatured way, which is a kind of reward and punishment model of karma. I do something good and God rewards me with a lollipop. I do something bad and God punishes me in some way, right? Now, the kernel of truth in the retributive doctrine of karma is that we reap what we sow. So fundamentally, the doctrine of karma is this principle that we reap what we sow. Okay, but the evolutionary approach to this karma doctrine is that we reap what we sow, surely, but the purpose of reaping what we sow is not for reward and punishment, but for moral and spiritual growth, our moral and spiritual evolution. So the overarching purpose of karma and rebirth are to foster our spiritual growth, ultimately leading to liberation. So if we have that idea to inspire us, that can really transform the way we think about ourselves, our day-to-day lives. In Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan Krishna says in chapter 6, Aneka janma samsiddhastato yati parangitam. So having attained perfection in the course of many lifetimes, right, through all of your spiritual practices in the course of, then you finally attain the highest goal of life.
True. I mean, there are so many other things that are coming to my mind, but I just have really one question, really based again on your book, because towards the end you talk about the implications of this of this understanding of this the doctrine of karma and rebirth, right? And I find it very interesting that you talk about how it could also have implications for environmental ethics. And I find that fascinating because, at least in my interactions with you, I see that climate change, concern for how things are it's something which seems to occupy a large part of the mind. I'm just curious, like, how could you just elaborate on that? What are its implications on our understanding of?
Yeah, so a few things. So first of all, fundamental to the Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth is that not just humans, but non-human animals and even plants have souls. They have jivas. And that fundamentally changes the way that we look at nature, if you think about it, right? Because it means that these trees that we see, these animals that we interact with, all the way from ants, all the way up to dogs and cows and cats, they're ensouled. And what does that mean? It means that they all have, in a certain sense, moral standing. Right? Because we have to treat them as souls rather than as whatever, machines or instruments for human pleasure or use, right? And so fundamentally, I think that transforms the way that we approach nature and our general environment. Now, there's another implication which has to do with what we eat, okay? Because a large part of the human population eats meat, right? They eat animals. And one of the arguable implications of the Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth is to remind us that if you're a non-vegetarian, you're eating non-vegetarian food, that those things that you're eating have souls. And so those animals, that those beings, those creatures have moral standing. And that when you're eating those animals, that you're not acknowledging that moral standing, for instance. And so, there are, of course, arguments back and forth and on both sides on these issues, but I think I just wanted to raise the issues at the end of the book, because I was limited to 30,000 words and I hit the absolute limit. And they didn't allow me to go even 5 words over the 30,000. So I had to be very succinct in what I was saying.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware at least that one of the, I think, I was once in a closed room meeting with a founder of a university because he was addressing counselors in my role as a career counselor. So he had mentioned this, like how he was seeing, this was about 3 years ago, he said how he's seeing almost 30% of the students from a very premier institution opting for careers in social work. And he said that there's really they look at this as a valid career path. But I'm also aware that for many of us, me included, who have been in this work prior to working at Viva, at some point one hits a limit, also almost because one can't kind of understand what's the ideological or the philosophical basis of that work. And I think, at least when I've had an opportunity to understand, like the idea of Vedantic virtue ethics that you share, when I'm able to understand my own motivations, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why be moral? Why be ethical? It kind of empowers me to kind of act and respond, I think, more authentically, rather than based on reward or what's right. It's really in keeping with who I'm as a person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, Maharaj, and I'm sure we could go on and have a much longer conversation. But I know you're working on another book project. Maybe we could just end with that. If you would like to just share what's your next project, and then we can end with that.
Okay. I've got 4 projects going on, so I'll just mention briefly what 4 of these writing projects. So one of them is I have 2 books under contract with Oxford University Press. One of them is the 3rd book in what I'm calling my Integral Advaita trilogy. So I've already published books on Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhananda. So the 3rd book is on Sri Aurobindo, and it's called An All-Embracing Oneness, Sri Aurobindo's Integral Advaita and the Legacy of Sri Ramakrishna, and I'm in the middle of working on that now. Now, at the same time, I'm about to finish a debate, a 4-part debate with Peter Hees, who's a prominent intellectual historian and somebody who's written biographies of Sri Aurobindo and Mother Mira Alfasa and other books. And so I've had this extended debate with him, which will be published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies, on my argument that I've been defending for a number of years now, that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana directly influenced Sri Aurobindo, his Vedantic thought, and the way that he's interpreted the Vedantic scriptures. And so he's arguing against that, and I'm kind of refining and developing my arguments in favor of that position. So keep your eyes out for that 4-part debate that should be coming out maybe in a few months in International Journal of Hindu Studies. The 3rd thing is the other book that's under contract with Oxford University Press is actually a book I'm editing, which is called Indian Spirituality in Contemporary Philosophy. About 15 philosophers, some of the best philosophers in the world from different countries, are contributing chapters on this theme, and exploring how different ideas and arguments from Indian spiritual traditions can enrich and really transform contemporary philosophical debates. And then a 4th project I'm co-editing along with a friend and German colleague of mine named Benedikt Paul Göke, a special issue of a journal that is slated to be published in Religious Studies, which is a journal published by Cambridge University Press. And the special issue's theme is consciousness in Indian theistic traditions, analytic perspectives. And so we have a number of scholars from different countries contributing articles for that special issue as well. So those are a few of the things I'm working on.
Fascinating. Our best wishes and prayers that all of these projects, see the light of day and really help. I mean, I think personally I've really benefited by attending the Gita class, where you make it very rigorous, right? Because you give us homework, and it helps me to kind of compare and contrast the different interpretations and really apply myself, bring my own understanding, listen to other views. And of course, the Patanjali Yoga Sutra class, where we are looking at Edwin Bryant's book as the textbook, but then also looking at it through different views, and also the gospel class. I've really benefited, and I think for the listeners who may not be aware of how, say, the Vedanta Society of Southern California is associated with, let's say, the Ramakrishna Mission Gurgaon, right? And I think that's why I really consider it a great privilege that, I really think of the genius of Swami Vivekananda to have this organization which, has spread its wings, is there across the world, allows us to have this kind of conversation.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, and I also wanted to bring your attention to the fact that what's the common denominator in all of the classes that you mentioned, right? In Yoga Sutra, I'm using Edwin Bryant's textbook. but also bringing in, traditional commentators and Swami Vivekananda's commentary and Haryana Aranya's commentary and modern scholarship. In the gospel class, I'm comparing Swami Nikhilananda's luminous English translation of the Bengali Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, but at the same time comparing it with the original Bengali text and sometimes pointing out discrepancies. And then with the Gita class, we have this completely different hermeneutic approach, which is to try to reinterpret, interpret afresh the Bhagavad Gita in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. Not at the expense of other commentators, but keeping a critical mind, and at the same time looking at Shankara's commentary, looking at Ramanuja's commentary, looking at Sri Aurobindo's commentary, looking at Tapasanji's commentary, and so on, and then thinking for yourself. And I always try to build in those questions in the study questions, also asking, what do you think? It's always that emphasis. What do you think at the end of the day? Yeah,
and I think and I'll just share my personal journey, especially regarding the Gita, right? Because it's the text that I first read when I was about 18, right? And my introduction was through Edwin Arnold's the song Celestial, right? And first of all, the language was something that I really couldn't follow. But I think it just evoked something very special. But I must be honest that it's only now when we are looking at it through in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, simply because I think what resonated with me again when I first learned of how Sri Ramakrishna says that really, if you say the word Gita 10 times, Gita, 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 how you get the real idea of what the Gita is all about. It's about Tyaga, right? About renunciation. It just struck me, and I felt I should know more about what the Gita is through his in his light. And I think your class enables me in my own limited way to at least try to develop an understanding and share it. And I'm so grateful that I mean, to have this opportunity to engage not just with you, but with your group of students in a way, and who come in with their diverse perspectives. I like the fact that you allow and encourage people to challenge your views, each other's views, place the understanding forward respectfully, and really, I think for me, this is really in the spirit of what Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda would have encouraged. And
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I appreciate your participation in all those classes as well. It's really wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Maharaj. So with this, I'm so grateful, and hopefully at some point in the future we could have a follow-up conversation. You have so many of your projects coming out. I'm sure that there'll be interesting topics for discussion on which we could reconnect and discuss again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay. Namaste.
Namaste.